Chapter 1. The Affair on the Liner. Magnifique, ejaculated the Countess de Coude beneath her breath. Eh? Questioned the Count, turning toward his young wife. What is it that is magnificent? And the Count bent his eyes in various directions in quest of the object of her admiration. Oh, nothing at all, my dear, replied the Countess, a slight flush momentarily colouring her already pink cheek. I was but recalling with admiration those stupendous skyscrapers, as they call them, of New York. And the fair Countess settled herself more comfortably in her steamer chair and resumed the magazine which nothing at all had caused her to let fall upon her lap. Her husband again buried himself in his book, but not without a mild wonderment that 3 days out from New York his Countess should suddenly have realized an admiration for the very buildings she had but recently characterized as horrid. Presently the Count put down his book. It is very tiresome, Olga, he said. I think that I shall hunt up some others who may be equally bored and see if we cannot find enough for a game of cards. You are not very gallant, my husband, replied the young woman, smiling, but as I am equally bored, I can forgive you. Go and play at your tiresome old cards then, if you will. When he had gone, she let her eyes wander slyly to the figure of a tall young man stretched lazily in a chair not far distant. Magnifique, she breathed once more. The Countess Olga de Coude was 20, her husband 40. She was a very faithful and loyal wife, but as she had had nothing whatever to do with the selection of a husband, it is not at all unlikely that she was not wildly and passionately in love with the one that fate and her titled Russian father had selected for her. However, simply because she was surprised into a tiny exclamation of approval at sight of a splendid young stranger, it must not be inferred therefrom that her thoughts were in any way disloyal to her spouse. She merely admired, as she might have admired a particularly fine specimen of any species. Furthermore, the young man was unquestionably good to look at. As her furtive glance rested upon his profile, he rose to leave the deck. The Countess de Coude beckoned to a passing steward. Who is that gentleman? She asked. He is booked, madam, as Monsieur Tarzan of Africa, replied the steward. Rather a large estate, thought the girl, but now her interest was still further aroused. As Tarzan walked slowly toward the smoking room, he came unexpectedly upon 2 men whispering excitedly just without. He would have vouchsafed them not even a passing thought, but for the strangely guilty glance that one of them shot in his direction. They reminded Tarzan of melodramatic villains he had seen at the theatres in Paris. Both were very dark, and this, in connection with the shrugs and stealthy glances that accompanied their palpable intriguing, lent still greater force to the similarity. Tarzan entered the smoking room and sought a chair a little apart from the others who were there. He felt in no mood for conversation, and as he sipped his absinthe, he let his mind run rather sorrowfully over the past few weeks of his life. Time and again he had wondered if he had acted wisely in renouncing his birthright to a man to whom he owed nothing. It is true that he liked Clayton, but that was not the question. It was not for William Cecil Clayton, Lord Greystoke, that he had denied his birth. It was for the woman whom both he and Clayton had loved, and whom a strange freak of fate had given to Clayton instead of to him. That she loved him made the thing doubly difficult to bear, yet he knew that he could have done nothing less than he did do that night within the little railway station in the far Wisconsin woods. To him, her happiness was the first consideration of all, and his brief experience with civilization and civilized men had taught him that without money and position, life to most of them was unendurable. Jane Porter had been born to both, and had Tarzan taken them away from her future husband, it would doubtless have plunged her into a life of misery and torture. That she would have spurned Clayton once he had been stripped of both his title and his estates never for once occurred to Tarzan, for he credited to others the same honest loyalty that was so inherent a quality in himself. Nor, in this instance, had he erred. Could any one thing have further bound Jane Porter to her promise to Clayton, it would have been in the nature of some such misfortune as this overtaking him. Tarzan's thoughts drifted from the past to the future. He tried to look forward with pleasurable sensations to his return to the jungle of his birth and boyhood, the cruel, fierce jungle in which he had spent 20 of his 22 years. But who or what of all the myriad jungle life would there be to welcome his return? Not one. Only Tantor, the elephant, could he call friend. The others would hunt him or flee from him, as had been their way in the past. Not even the apes of his own tribe would extend the hand of fellowship to him. If civilization had done nothing else for Tarzan of the apes, it had to some extent taught him to crave the society of his own kind, and to feel with genuine pleasure the congenial warmth of companionship. And in the same ratio had it made any other life distasteful to him. It was difficult to imagine a world without a friend, without a living thing who spoke the new tongues which Tarzan had learned to love so well. And so it was that Tarzan looked with little relish upon the future he had mapped out for himself. As he sat musing over his cigarette, his eyes fell upon a mirror before him, and in it he saw reflected a table at which 4 men sat at cards. Presently one of them rose to leave, and then another approached, and Tarzan could see that he courteously offered to fill the vacant chair, that the game might not be interrupted. He was the smaller of the two whom Tarzan had seen whispering just outside the smoking room. It was this fact that aroused a faint spark of interest in Tarzan, and so as he speculated upon the future, he watched in the mirror the reflection of the players at the table behind him. Aside from the man who had but just entered the game, Tarzan knew the name of but one of the other players. It was he who sat opposite the new player, Count Raoul de Coude, whom an over-attentive steward had pointed out as one of the celebrities of the passage, describing him as a man high in the official family of the French Minister of War. Suddenly Tarzan's attention was riveted upon the picture in the glass. The other swarthy plotter had entered and was standing behind the Count's chair. Tarzan saw him turn and glance furtively about the room, but his eyes did not rest for a sufficient time upon the mirror to note the reflection of Tarzan's watchful eyes. Stealthily the man withdrew something from his pocket. Tarzan could not discern what the object was, for the man's hand covered it. Slowly the hand approached the Count, and then, very deftly, the thing that was in it was transferred to the Count's pocket. The man remained standing where he could watch the Frenchman's cards. Tarzan was puzzled, but he was all attention now, nor did he permit another detail of the incident to escape him. The play went on for some 10 minutes after this, until the Count won a considerable wager from him who had last joined the game, and then Tarzan saw the fellow back of the Count's chair nod his head to his confederate. Instantly the player arose and pointed a finger at the Count. Had I known that Monsieur was a professional card-sharp, I had not been so ready to be drawn into the game, he said. Instantly the Count and the 2 other players were upon their feet. De Coude's face went white. "What do you mean, sir?" he cried. "Do you know to whom you speak?" "I know that I speak, for the last time, to one who cheats at cards," replied the fellow. The Count leaned across the table and struck the man full in the mouth with his open palm, and then the others closed in between them. "There is some mistake, sir," cried one of the other players. "Why, this is Count de Coude of France." "If I am mistaken," said the accuser, "I shall gladly apologize, but before I do so, first let Monsieur le Comte explain the extra cards which I saw him drop into his side pocket." And then the man whom Tarzan had seen drop them there turned to sneak from the room. But to his annoyance, he found the exit barred by a tall, grey-eyed stranger. "Pardon," said the man brusquely, attempting to pass to one side. "Wait," said Tarzan. "But why, monsieur?" exclaimed the other petulantly. "Permit me to pass, monsieur." "Wait," said Tarzan. "I think that there is a matter in here that you may doubtless be able to explain." The fellow had lost his temper by this time, and with a low oath seized Tarzan to push him to one side. The ape-man but smiled as he twisted the big fellow about, and grasping him by the collar of his coat, escorted him back to the table, struggling, cursing, and striking in futile remonstrance. It was Nikolas Rokoff's first experience with the muscles that had brought their savage owner victorious through encounters with Numa, the lion, and Turcos, the great bull ape. The man who had accused de Coude and the 2 others who had been playing stood looking expectantly at the Count. Several other passengers had drawn toward the scene of the altercation, and all awaited the denouement. "The fellow is crazy," said the Count. "Gentlemen, I implore that one of you search me. The accusation is ridiculous." This from one of the players. "You have but to slip your hand in the Count's coat pocket, and you will see that the accusation is quite serious," insisted the accuser. And then, as the others still hesitated to do so, "Come, I shall do it myself if no other will," and he stepped forward toward the Count. "No, monsieur," said de Coude, "I will submit to a search only at the hands of a gentleman." "It is unnecessary to search the Count. The cards are in his pocket. I myself saw them placed there." All turned in surprise toward this new speaker to behold a very well-built young man urging a resisting captive toward them by the scruff of his neck. "It is a conspiracy," cried de Coude angrily. "There are no cards in my coat." And with that, he ran his hand into his pocket. As he did so, tense silence reigned in the little group. The Count went dead white, and then very slowly he withdrew his hand, and in it were 3 cards. He looked at them in mute and horrified surprise, and slowly the red of mortification suffused his face. Expressions of pity and contempt tinged the features of those who looked on at the death of a man's honor. "It is a conspiracy, monsieur." It was the grey-eyed stranger who spoke. "Gentlemen," he continued, "Monsieur le Count did not know that those cards were in his pocket. They were placed there without his knowledge as he sat at play. From where I sat in that chair yonder, I saw the reflection of it all in the mirror before me. This person whom I just intercepted, in an effort to escape, placed the cards in the Count's pocket." De Coude had glanced from Tarzan to the man in his grasp. "Mon Dieu, Nikolas," he cried. "You?" Then he turned to his accuser and eyed him intently for a moment. "And you, monsieur, I did not recognize you without your beard. It quite disguises you, Paulvitch. I see it all now. It is quite clear, gentlemen." "What shall we do with them, monsieur?" asked Tarzan. "Turn them over to the captain." "No, my friend," said the Count hastily. "It is a personal matter, and I beg that you will let it drop. It is sufficient that I have been exonerated from the charge. The less we have to do with such fellows, the better. But, monsieur, how can I thank you for the great kindness you have done me? Permit me to offer you my card, and should the time come when I may serve you, remember that I am yours to command." Tarzan had released Rokoff, who, with his confederate Paulvitch, had hastened from the smoking room. Just as he was leaving, Rokoff turned to Tarzan. "Monsieur will have ample opportunity to regret his interference in the affairs of others." Tarzan smiled, and then, bowing to the Count, handed him his own card. The Count read, "Monsieur Jean C. Tarzan." "Monsieur Tarzan," he said, "may indeed wish that he had never befriended me, for I can assure him that he has won the enmity of 2 of the most unmitigated scoundrels in all Europe. Avoid them, monsieur, by all means." "I have had more awe-inspiring enemies, my dear Count," replied Tarzan with a quiet smile, "yet I am still alive and unworried. I think that neither of these 2 will ever find the means to harm me." "Let us hope not, monsieur," said de Coude, "but yet it will do no harm to be on the alert, and to know that you have made at least one enemy today who never forgets and never forgives, and in whose malignant brain there are always hatching new atrocities to perpetrate upon those who have thwarted or offended him. To say that Nikolas Rokoff is a devil would be to place a wanton affront upon his satanic majesty." That night, as Tarzan entered his cabin, he found a folded note upon the floor that had evidently been pushed beneath the door. He opened it and read, "Monsieur Tarzan, doubtless you did not realize the gravity of your offense, or you would not have done the thing you did today. I am willing to believe that you acted in ignorance and without any intention to offend a stranger. For this reason, I shall gladly permit you to offer an apology, and on receiving your assurances that you will not again interfere in affairs that do not concern you, I shall drop the matter. Otherwise, but I am sure that you will see the wisdom of adopting the course I suggest. Very respectfully, Nikolas Rokoff." Tarzan permitted a grim smile to play about his lips for a moment, then he promptly dropped the matter from his mind and went to bed. In a nearby cabin, the Countess de Coude was speaking to her husband. "Why so grave, my dear Raoul?" she asked. "You have been as glum as could be all evening. What worries you?" "Olga, Nikolas is on board. Did you know it?" "Nikolas!" she exclaimed. "But it is impossible, Raoul. It cannot be. Nikolas is under arrest in Germany." "So I thought myself until I saw him today, him and that other arch-scoundrel, Paulvitch. Olga, I cannot endure his persecution much longer. No, not even for you. Sooner or later I shall turn him over to the authorities. In fact, I am half-minded to explain all to the captain before we land. On a French liner it were an easy matter, Olga, permanently to settle this nemesis of ours. Oh no, Raoul, cried the Countess, sinking to her knees before him as he sat with bowed head upon a divan. Do not do that. Remember your promise to me. Tell me, Raoul, that you will not do that. Do not even threaten him, Raoul. De Coude took his wife's hands in his and gazed upon her pale and troubled countenance for some time before he spoke, as though he would wrest from those beautiful eyes the real reason which prompted her to shield this man. Let it be as you wish, Olga, he said at length. I cannot understand. He has forfeited all claim upon your love, loyalty, or respect. He is a menace to your life and honor, and the life and honor of your husband. I trust you may never regret championing him. I do not champion him, Raoul, she interrupted vehemently. I believe that I hate him as much as you do, but, oh, Raoul, blood is thicker than water. I should today have liked to sample the consistency of his, growled de Coude grimly. The two deliberately attempted to besmirch my honor, Olga. And then he told her of all that had happened in the smoking room. Had it not been for this utter stranger, they had succeeded, for who would have accepted my unsupported word against the damning evidence of those cards hidden on my person? I had almost begun to doubt myself when this Monsieur Tarzan dragged your precious Nikolas before us and explained the whole cowardly transaction. Monsieur Tarzan? Asked the Countess in evident surprise. Yes. Do you know him, Olga? I have seen him. A steward pointed him out to me. I did not know that he was a celebrity, said the Count. Olga de Coude changed the subject. She discovered suddenly that she might find it difficult to explain just why the steward had pointed out the handsome Monsieur Tarzan to her. Perhaps she flushed the least little bit, for was not the Count, her husband, gazing at her with a strangely quizzical expression? Ah, she thought, a guilty conscience is a most suspicious thing. Chapter 2, Forging Bonds of Hate, and it was not until late the following afternoon that Tarzan saw anything more of the fellow passengers into the midst of whose affairs his love of fair play had thrust him. And then he came most unexpectedly upon Rokoff and Paulvitch at a moment when of all others the two might least appreciate his company. They were standing on deck at a point which was temporarily deserted, and as Tarzan came upon them, they were in heated argument with a woman. Tarzan noted that she was richly apparelled, and that her slender, well-modelled figure denoted youth, but as she was heavily veiled, he could not discern her features. The men were standing on either side of her, and the backs of all were toward Tarzan, so that he was quite close to them, without their being aware of his presence. He noticed that Rokoff seemed to be threatening, the woman pleading, but they spoke in a strange tongue, and he could only guess from appearances that the girl was afraid. Rokoff's attitude was so distinctly filled with the threat of physical violence that the apt man paused for an instant just behind the trio, instinctively sensing an atmosphere of danger. Scarcely had he hesitated ere the man seized the woman roughly by the wrist, twisting it as though to wring a promise from her through torture. What would have happened next, had Rokoff had his way, we may only conjecture, since he did not have his way at all. Instead, steel fingers gripped his shoulder, and he was swung unceremoniously around to meet the cold, grey eyes of the stranger who had thwarted him on the previous day. "Sapristi!" screamed the infuriated Rokoff. "What do you mean? Are you a fool that you thus again insult Nikolas Rokoff?" "This is my answer to your note, monsieur," said Tarzan in a low voice, and then he hurled the fellow from him with such force that Rokoff lunged sprawling against the rail. "Name of a name!" shrieked Rokoff. "Pig, but you shall die for this!" And springing to his feet, he rushed upon Tarzan, tugging the meanwhile to draw a revolver from his hip pocket. The girl shrank back in terror. "Nikolas!" she cried. "Do not do that! Quick, monsieur, fly, or he will surely kill you!" But instead of flying, Tarzan advanced to meet the fellow. "Do not make a fool of yourself, monsieur," he said. Rokoff, who was in a perfect frenzy of rage at the humiliation the stranger had put upon him, had at last succeeded in drawing the revolver. He had stopped, and now he deliberately raised it to Tarzan's breast and pulled the trigger. The hammer fell with a futile click on an empty chamber. The ape-man's hand shot out like the head of an angry python. There was a quick wrench, and the revolver sailed far out across the ship's rail and dropped into the Atlantic. For a moment, the two men stood there facing one another. Rokoff had regained his self-possession. He was the first to speak. Twice now has Monsieur seen fit to interfere in matters which do not concern him. Twice he has taken it upon himself to humiliate Nikolas Rokoff. The first offence was overlooked on the assumption that Monsieur acted through ignorance, but this affair shall not be overlooked. If Monsieur does not know who Nikolas Rokoff is, this last piece of effrontery will ensure that Monsieur later has good reason to remember him. "That you are a coward and a scoundrel, Monsieur," replied Tarzan, "is all that I care to know of you." And he turned to ask the girl if the man had hurt her, but she had disappeared. Then, without even a glance toward Rokoff and his companion, he continued his stroll along the deck. Tarzan could not but wonder what manner of conspiracy was on foot, or what the scheme of the two men might be. There had been something rather familiar about the appearance of the veiled woman to whose rescue he had just come. But as he had not seen her face, he could not be sure that he had ever seen her before. The only thing about her that he had particularly noticed was a ring of peculiar workmanship upon a finger of the hand that Rokoff had seized, and he determined to note the fingers of the women passengers he came upon thereafter, that he might discover the identity of her whom Rokoff was persecuting, and learn if the fellow had offered her further annoyance. Tarzan had sought his deck chair, where he sat speculating on the numerous instances of human cruelty, selfishness, and spite that had fallen to his lot to witness since that day in the jungle 4 years since that his eyes had first fallen upon a human being other than himself. The sleek black Kulonga, whose swift spear had that day found the vitals of Kala, the great she-ape, and robbed the youth Tarzan of the only mother he had ever known. He recalled the murder of King by the rat-faced snipes, the abandonment of Professor Porter and his party by the mutineers of the Arrow, the cruelty of the black warriors and women of Mbonga to their captives, the petty jealousies of the civil and military officers of the West Coast colony that had afforded him his first introduction to the civilized world. "Mon Dieu," he soliloquized, "but they are all alike, cheating, murdering, lying, fighting, and all for things that the beasts of the jungle would not deign to possess, money to purchase the effeminate pleasures of weaklings, and yet withal bound down by silly customs that make them slaves to their unhappy lot, while firm in the belief that they be the lords of creation, enjoying the only real pleasures of existence. In the jungle, one would scarcely stand supinely aside while another took his mate. It is a silly world, an idiotic world, and Tarzan of the Apes was a fool to renounce the freedom and the happiness of his jungle to come into it. Presently, as he sat there, the sudden feeling came over him that eyes were watching from behind, and the old instinct of the wild beast broke through the thin veneer of civilization, so that Tarzan wheeled about so quickly that the eyes of the young woman who had been surreptitiously regarding him had not even time to drop before the grey eyes of the ape-man shot an inquiring look straight into them. Then, as they fell, Tarzan saw a faint wave of crimson creep swiftly over the now half-averted face. He smiled to himself at the result of his very uncivilized and ungallant action, for he had not lowered his own eyes when they met those of the young woman. She was very young and equally good to look upon. And further, there was something rather familiar about her that set Tarzan to wondering where he had seen her before. He resumed his former position, and presently he was aware that she had arisen and was leaving the deck. As she passed, Tarzan turned to watch her, in the hope that he might discover a clue to satisfy his mild curiosity as to her identity. Nor was he disappointed entirely, for as she walked away, she raised one hand to the black, waving mass at the nape of her neck, the peculiarly feminine gesture that admits a cognizance of appraising eyes behind her, and Tarzan saw upon a finger of this hand the ring of strange workmanship that he had seen upon the finger of the veiled woman a short time before. So it was this beautiful young woman Rokoff had been persecuting. Tarzan wondered in a lazy sort of way whom she might be, and what relations one so lovely could have with the surly bearded Russian. After dinner that evening, Tarzan strolled forward, where he remained until after dark, in conversation with the second officer, and when that gentleman's duties called him elsewhere, Tarzan lolled lazily by the rail, watching the play of the moonlight upon the gently rolling waters. He was half hidden by a davit, so that two men who approached along the deck did not see him, and as they passed, Tarzan caught enough of their conversation to cause him to fall in behind them, to follow and learn what deviltry they were up to. He had recognized the voice as that of Rokoff, and had seen that his companion was Paulvitch. Tarzan had overheard but a few words. "And if she screams, you may choke her until—" But those had been enough to arouse the spirit of adventure within him, and so he kept the two men in sight as they walked briskly now along the deck. To the smoking room he followed them, but they merely halted at the doorway long enough, apparently, to assure themselves that one whose whereabouts they wished to establish was within. Then they proceeded directly to the first-class cabins upon the promenade deck. Here Tarzan found greater difficulty in escaping detection, but he managed to do so successfully. As they halted before one of the polished hardwood doors, Tarzan slipped into the shadow of a passageway not a dozen feet from them. To their knock, a woman's voice asked in French, "Who is it?" "It is I, Olga." "Nikolas," was the answer, in Rokoff's now familiar guttural. "May I come in?" "Why do you not cease persecuting me, Nikolas?" came the voice of the woman from beyond the thin panel. "I have never harmed you." "Come, come, Olga," urged the man in propitiatory tones. "I but ask a half-dozen words with you. I shall not harm you, nor shall I enter your cabin, but I cannot shout my message through the door." Tarzan heard the catch click as it was released from the inside. He stepped out from his hiding place far enough to see what transpired when the door was opened, for he could not but recall the sinister words he had heard a few moments before upon the deck. "And if she screams, you may choke her." Rokoff was standing directly in front of the door. Paulvitch had flattened himself against the panelled wall of the corridor beyond. The door opened. Rokoff half entered the room and stood with his back against the door, speaking in a low whisper to the woman whom Tarzan could not see. Then Tarzan heard the woman's voice, level but loud enough to distinguish her words. "No, Nikolas," she was saying, "it is useless. Threaten as you will, I shall never accede to your demands. Leave the room, please. You have no right here. You promised not to enter." "Very well, Olga, I shall not enter. But before I am done with you, you shall wish 1,000 times that you had done at once the favor I have asked. In the end, I shall win anyway, so you might as well save trouble and time for me and disgrace for yourself and your—" "Never, Nikolas," interrupted the woman, and then Tarzan saw Rokoff turn and nod to Paulvitch, who sprang quickly toward the doorway of the cabin, rushing in past Rokoff, who held the door open for him. Then the latter stepped quickly out. The door closed. Tarzan heard the click of the lock as Paulvitch turned it from the inside. Rokoff remained standing before the door, with head bent, as though to catch the words of the two within. A nasty smile curled his bearded lip. Tarzan could hear the woman's voice commanding the fellow to leave her cabin. "I shall send for my husband," she cried. "He will show you no mercy." Paulvitch's sneering laugh came through the polished panels. "The purser will fetch your husband, madame," said the man. "In fact, that officer has already been notified that you are entertaining a man other than your husband behind the locked door of your cabin." "Bah!" cried the woman. "My husband will know." "Most assuredly your husband will know, but the purser will not. Nor will the newspaper men who shall in some mysterious way hear of it on our landing. But they will think it a fine story, and so will all your friends when they read of it at breakfast on— let me see, this is Tuesday. Yes, when they read of it at breakfast next Friday morning. Nor will it detract from the interest they will all feel when they learn that the man whom Madame entertained is a Russian servant, her brother's valet, to be quite exact." "Alexis Paulvitch," came the woman's voice, cold and fearless. "You are a coward, and when I whisper a certain name in your ear, you will think better of your demands upon me and your threats against me, and then you will leave my cabin quickly. Nor do I think that ever again will you, at least, annoy me." And there came a moment's silence in which Tarzan could imagine the woman leaning toward the scoundrel and whispering the thing she had hinted at into his ear. Only a moment of silence, and then a startled oath from the man, the scuffling of feet, a woman's scream, and silence. But scarcely had the cry ceased before the ape-man had leapt from his hiding place. Rokoff started to run, but Tarzan grasped him by the collar and dragged him back. Neither spoke, for both felt instinctively that murder was being done in that room. And Tarzan was confident that Rokoff had had no intention that his confederate should go that far. He felt that the man's aims were deeper than that, deeper and even more sinister than brutal, cold-blooded murder. Without hesitating to question those within, the ape-man threw his giant shoulder against the frail panel, and in a shower of splintered wood he entered the cabin, dragging Rokoff after him. Before him, on a couch, the woman lay, and on top of her was Paulvitch, his fingers gripping the fair throat, while his victim's hands beat futilely at his face, tearing desperately at the cruel fingers that were forcing the life from her. The noise of his entrance brought Paulvitch to his feet, where he stood glowering menacingly at Tarzan. The girl rose falteringly to a sitting posture upon the couch. One hand was at her throat, and her breath came in little gasps. Although dishevelled and very pale, Tarzan recognized her as the young woman whom he had caught staring at him on deck earlier in the day. "What is the meaning of this?" said Tarzan, turning to Rokoff, whom he intuitively singled out as the instigator of the outrage. The man remained silent, scowling. "Touch the button, please," continued the ape-man. "We will have one of the ship's officers here. This affair has gone quite far enough." "No, no," cried the girl, coming suddenly to her feet. "Please do not do that. I am sure that there was no real intention to harm me. I angered this person, and he lost control of himself, that is all. I would not care to have the matter go further. Please, monsieur." And there was such a note of pleading in her voice that Tarzan could not press the matter, though his better judgment warned him that there was something afoot here of which the proper authorities should be made cognizant. "You wish me to do nothing, then, in the matter?" he asked. "Nothing, please," she replied. "You are content that these two scoundrels should continue persecuting you?" She did not seem to know what answer to make, and looked very troubled and unhappy. Tarzan saw a malicious grin of triumph curl Rokoff's lip. The girl evidently was in fear of these two. She dared not express her real desires before them. "Then," said Tarzan, "I shall act on my own responsibility. To you," he continued, turning to Rokoff, "and this includes your accomplice, I may say that from now on to the end of the voyage, I shall take it upon myself to keep an eye on you, and should there chance to come to my notice any act of either one of you that might even remotely annoy this young woman, you shall be called to account for it directly to me, nor shall the calling or the accounting be pleasant experiences for either of you. Now get out of here." And he grabbed Rokoff and Paulvitch each by the scruff of the neck and thrust them forcibly through the doorway, giving each an added impetus down the corridor with the toe of his boot. Then he turned back to the stateroom and the girl. She was looking at him in wide-eyed astonishment. "And you, madame, will confer a great favour upon me if you will but let me know if either of those rascals troubles you further." "Ah, monsieur," she answered, "I hope that you will not suffer for the kind deed you attempted. You have made a very wicked and resourceful enemy, who will stop at nothing to satisfy his hatred. You must be very careful indeed, monsieur." "Pardon me, madame, my name is Tarzan." "Monsieur Tarzan, and because I would not consent to notify the officers, do not think that I am not sincerely grateful to you for the brave and chivalrous protection you rendered me. Good night, Monsieur Tarzan. I shall never forget the debt I owe you." And with a most winsome smile that displayed a row of perfect teeth, the girl curtsied to Tarzan, who bade her good night and made his way on deck. It puzzled the man considerably that there should be two on board, this girl and Count de Coude, who suffered indignities at the hands of Rokoff and his companion, and yet would not permit the offenders to be brought to justice. Before he turned in that night, his thoughts reverted many times to the beautiful young woman into the evidently tangled web of whose life fate had so strangely introduced him. It occurred to him that he had not learned her name. That she was married had been evidenced by the narrow gold band that encircled the third finger of her left hand. Involuntarily, he wondered who the lucky man might be. Tarzan saw nothing further of any of the actors in the little drama that he had caught a fleeting glimpse of until late in the afternoon of the last day of the voyage. Then he came suddenly face to face with the young woman as the two approached their deck chairs from opposite directions. She greeted him with a pleasant smile, speaking almost immediately of the affair he had witnessed in her cabin 2 nights before. It was as though she had been perturbed by a conviction that he might have construed her acquaintance with such men as Rokoff and Paulvitch as a personal reflection upon herself. "I trust Monsieur has not judged me," she said, "by the unfortunate occurrence of Tuesday evening. I have suffered much on account of it. This is the first time that I have ventured from my cabin since. I have been ashamed," she concluded simply. "One does not judge the gazelle by the lions that attack it," replied Tarzan. "I had seen those two work before, in the smoking room the day prior to their attack on you, if I recollect it correctly, and so, knowing their methods, I am convinced that their enmity is a sufficient guarantee of the integrity of its object. Men such as they must cleave only to the vile, hating all that is noblest and best." "It is very kind of you to put it that way," she replied, smiling. "I have already heard of the matter of the card game. My husband told me the entire story. He spoke especially of the strength and bravery of Monsieur Tarzan, to whom he feels that he owes an immense debt of gratitude." "Your husband?" repeated Tarzan questioningly. "Yes, I am the Countess de Coude." "I am already amply repaid, madame, in knowing that I have rendered a service to the wife of the Count de Coude. Alas, monsieur, I already am so greatly indebted to you that I may never hope to settle my own account, so pray do not add further to my obligations." And she smiled so sweetly upon him that Tarzan felt that a man might easily attempt much greater things than he had accomplished, solely for the pleasure of receiving the benediction of that smile. He did not see her again that day, and in the rush of landing on the following morning he missed her entirely, but there had been something in the expression of her eyes as they parted on deck the previous day that haunted him. It had been almost wistful, as they had spoken of the strangeness of the swift friendships of an ocean crossing, and of the equal ease with which they are broken forever. Tarzan wondered if he should ever see her again. Chapter 3. What happened in the Rue Maule? On his arrival in Paris, Tarzan had gone directly to the apartments of his old friend D'Arnaud, where the naval lieutenant had scored him roundly for his decision to renounce the title and estates that were rightly his from his father, John Clayton, the late Lord Greystoke. "You must be mad, my friend," said D'Arnaud, "thus lightly to give up not alone wealth and position, but an opportunity to prove beyond doubt to all the world that in your veins flows the noble blood of 2 of England's most honoured houses, instead of the blood of a savage she-ape. It is incredible that they could have believed you, Miss Porter least of all. Why, I never did believe it, even back in the wilds of your African jungle, when you tore the raw meat of your kills with mighty jaws, like some wild beast, and wiped your greasy hands upon your thighs. Even then, before there was the slightest proof to the contrary, I knew that you were mistaken in the belief that Carla was your mother. And now, with your father's diary of the terrible life led by him and your mother on that wild African shore, with the account of your birth, and final and most convincing proof of all, your own baby finger prints upon the pages of it, it seems incredible to me that you are willing to remain a nameless, penniless vagabond." "I do not need any better name than Tarzan," replied the ape-man, "and as for remaining a penniless vagabond, I have no intention of so doing. In fact, the next, and let us hope the last, burden that I shall be forced to put upon your unselfish friendship will be the finding of employment for me." "Pooh, pooh," scoffed D'Arnaud. "You know that I did not mean that. Have I not told you a dozen times that I have enough for 20 men, and that half of what I have is yours? And if I gave it all to you, would it represent even the 10th part of the value I place upon your friendship, my Tarzan? Would it repay the services you did me in Africa? I do not forget, my friend, that but for you and your wondrous bravery, I had died at the stake in the village of Mbonga's cannibals. Nor do I forget that to your self-sacrificing devotion, I owe the fact that I recovered from the terrible wounds I received at their hands. I discovered later something of what it meant to you to remain with me in the amphitheatre of apes, while your heart was urging you on to the coast. When we finally came there and found that Miss Porter and her party had left, I commenced to realize something of what you had done for an utter stranger. Nor am I trying to repay you with money, Tarzan. It is that just at present you need money. Were it sacrifice that I might offer you, it were the same. My friendship must always be yours, because our tastes are similar, and I admire you. That I cannot command, but the money I can and shall. Well, laughed Tarzan, we shall not quarrel over the money. I must live, and so I must have it. But I shall be more contented with something to do. You cannot show me your friendship in a more convincing manner than to find employment for me. I shall die of inactivity in a short while. As for my birthright, it is in good hands. Clayton is not guilty of robbing me of it. He truly believes that he is the real Lord Greystoke, and the chances are that he will make a better English lord than a man who was born and raised in an African jungle. You know that I am but half civilized even now. Let me see red in anger, but for a moment, and all the instincts of the savage beast that I really am, submerge what little I possess of the milder ways of culture and refinement. And then again, had I declared myself, I should have robbed the woman I love of the wealth and position that her marriage to Clayton will now ensure to her. I could not have done that, could I, Paul? Nor is the matter of birth of great importance to me, he went on, without waiting for a reply. Raised as I have been, I see no worth in man or beast that is not theirs by virtue of their own mental or physical prowess. And so I am as happy to think of Carla as my mother as I would be to try to picture the poor, unhappy little English girl who passed away a year after she bore me. Carla was always kind to me in her fierce and savage way. I must have nursed at her hairy breast from the time that my own mother died. She fought for me against the wild denizens of the forest and against the savage members of our tribe with the ferocity of real mother love. And I, on my part, loved her, Paul. I did not realize how much until after the cruel spear and the poisoned arrow of Mbonga's black warrior had stolen her away from me. I was still a child when that occurred, and I threw myself upon her dead body and wept out my anguish as a child might for his own mother. To you, my friend, she would have appeared a hideous and ugly creature. But to me she was beautiful. So gloriously does love transfigure its object. And so I am perfectly content to remain forever the son of Carla, the she-ape. I do not admire you the less for your loyalty, said D'Arnaud, but the time will come when you will be glad to claim your own. Remember what I say, and let us hope that it will be as easy then as it is now. You must bear in mind that Professor Porter and Mr. Philander are the only people in the world who can swear that the little skeleton found in the cabin with those of your father and mother was that of an infant anthropoid ape, and not the offspring of Lord and Lady Greystoke. That evidence is most important. They are both old men. They may not live many years longer. And then, did it not occur to you that once Miss Porter knew the truth, she would break her engagement with Clayton? You might easily have your title, your estates, and the woman you love, Tarzan. Had you not thought of that? Tarzan shook his head. You do not know her, he said. Nothing could bind her closer to her bargain than some misfortune to Clayton. She is from an old Southern family in America, and Southerners pride themselves upon their loyalty. Tarzan spent the 2 following weeks renewing his former brief acquaintance with Paris. In the daytime he haunted the libraries and picture galleries. He had become an omnivorous reader, and the world of possibilities that were open to him in this seat of culture and learning fairly appalled him when he contemplated the very infinitesimal crumb of the sum total of human knowledge that a single individual might hope to acquire even after a lifetime of study and research. But he learned what he could by day and threw himself into a search for relaxation and amusement at night. Nor did he find Paris a whit less fertile field for his nocturnal avocation. If he smoked too many cigarettes and drank too much absinthe, it was because he took civilization as he found it, and did the things that he found his civilized brothers doing. The life was a new and alluring one, and in addition he had a sorrow in his breast, and a great longing which he knew could never be fulfilled. And so he sought in study and in dissipation, the 2 extremes, to forget the past, and inhibit contemplation of the future. He was sitting in a music hall one evening, sipping his absinthe and admiring the art of a certain famous Russian dancer, when he caught a passing glimpse of a pair of evil black eyes upon him. the man turned and was lost in the crowd at the exit before Tarzan could catch a good look at him. But he was confident that he had seen those eyes before and that they had been fastened on him this evening through no passing accident. He had had the uncanny feeling for some time that he was being watched, and it was in response to this animal instinct that was strong within him that he had turned suddenly and he surprised the eyes in the very act of watching him. Before he left the music hall, the matter had been forgotten. Nor did he notice the swarthy individual who stepped deeper into the shadows of an opposite doorway as Tarzan emerged from the brilliantly lighted amusement hall. Had Tarzan but known it, he had been followed many times from this and other places of amusement, but seldom, if ever, had he been alone. Tonight D'Arnaud had had another engagement, and Tarzan had come by himself. As he turned in the direction he was accustomed to taking from this part of Paris to his apartments, the watcher across the street ran from his hiding place and hurried on ahead at a rapid pace. Tarzan had been wont to traverse the Rue Maule on his way home at night. Because it was very quiet and very dark, it reminded him more of his beloved African jungle than did the noisy and garish streets surrounding it. If you are familiar with your Paris, you will recall the narrow, forbidding precincts of the Rue Maule. If you are not, you need but ask the police about it to learn that in all Paris there is no street to which you should give a wider berth after dark. On this night, Tarzan had proceeded some 2 squares through the dense shadows of the squalid old tenements which line this dismal way when he was attracted by screams and cries for help from the 3rd floor of an opposite building. The voice was a woman's. Before the echoes of her first cries had died, Tarzan was bounding up the stairs and through the dark corridors to her rescue. At the end of the corridor on the 3rd landing, a door stood slightly ajar, and from within, Tarzan heard again the same appeal that had lured him from the street. Another instant found him in the center of a dimly lighted room. An oil lamp burned upon a high, old-fashioned mantel, casting its dim rays over a dozen repulsive figures. All but one were men. The other was a woman of about 30. Her face, marked by low passions and dissipation, might once have been lovely. She stood with one hand at her throat, crouching against the farther wall. "Help, monsieur," she cried in a low voice as Tarzan entered the room. "They were killing me." As Tarzan turned toward the men about him, he saw the crafty, evil faces of habitual criminals. He wondered that they had made no effort to escape. A movement behind him caused him to turn. 2 things his eyes saw, and one of them caused him considerable wonderment. A man was sneaking stealthily from the room, and in the brief glance that Tarzan had of him, he saw that it was Rokoff. But the other thing that he saw was of more immediate interest. It was a great brute of a fellow tiptoeing upon him from behind with a huge bludgeon in his hand. And then, as the man and his confederates saw that he was discovered, there was a concerted rush upon Tarzan from all sides. Some of the men drew knives, others picked up chairs, while the fellow with the bludgeon raised it high above his head in a mighty swing that would have crushed Tarzan's head had it ever descended upon it. But the brain and the agility and the muscles that had coped with the mighty strength and cruel craftiness of Turcos and Numa in the fastness of their savage jungle were not to be so easily subdued as these Apaches of Paris had believed. Selecting his most formidable antagonist, the fellow with the bludgeon, Tarzan charged full upon him, dodging the falling weapon and catching the man a terrific blow on the point of the chin that felled him in his tracks. Then he turned upon the others. This was sport. He was reveling in the joy of battle and the lust of blood. As though it had been but a brittle shell to break at the least rough usage, the thin veneer of his civilization fell from him, and the 10 burly villains found themselves penned in a small room with a wild and savage beast, against whose steel muscles their puny strength was less than futile. At the end of the corridor without stood Rokoff, waiting the outcome of the affair. He wished to be sure that Tarzan was dead before he left, but it was not a part of his plan to be one of those within the room when the murder occurred. The woman still stood where she had when Tarzan entered, but her face had undergone a number of changes with the few minutes which had elapsed. From the semblance of distress which it had worn when Tarzan first saw it, it had changed to one of craftiness as he had wheeled to meet the attack from behind. But the change Tarzan had not seen. Later, an expression of surprise and then one of horror superseded the others. And who may wonder? For the immaculate gentleman her cries had lured to what was to have been his death had been suddenly metamorphosed into a demon of revenge. Instead of soft muscles and a weak resistance, she was looking upon a veritable Hercules gone mad. "Mon Dieu," she cried, "he is a beast." For the strong white teeth of the ape-man had found the throat of one of his assailants, and Tarzan fought as he had learned to fight with the great bull apes of the tribe of Kerchak. He was in a dozen places at once, leaping hither and thither about the room in sinuous bounds that reminded the woman of a panther she had seen at the zoo. Now a wrist bone snapped in his iron grip. Now a shoulder was wrenched from its socket as he forced a victim's arm backward and upward. With shrieks of pain, the men escaped into the hallway as quickly as they could. But even before the first one staggered, bleeding and broken, from the room, Rokoff had seen enough to convince him that Tarzan would not be the one to lie dead in that house this night. And so the Russian had hastened to a nearby den and telephoned the police that a man was committing murder on the 3rd floor of Rue Maule, 27. When the officers arrived, they found 3 men groaning on the floor, a frightened woman lying upon a filthy bed, her face buried in her arms, and what appeared to be a well-dressed young gentleman standing in the center of the room, awaiting the reinforcements which he had thought the footsteps of the officers hurrying up the stairway had announced. But they were mistaken in the last. It was a wild beast that looked upon them through those narrowed lids and steel-grey eyes. With the smell of blood, the last vestige of civilization had deserted Tarzan, and now he stood at bay, like a lion surrounded by hunters, awaiting the next overt act and crouching to charge its author. "What has happened here?" asked one of the policemen. Tarzan explained briefly, but when he turned to the woman for confirmation of his statement, he was appalled by her reply. "He lies," she screamed shrilly, addressing the policeman. "He came to my room while I was alone, and for no good purpose. When I repulsed him, he would have killed me had not my screams attracted these gentlemen, who were passing the house at the time. He is a devil, messieurs. Alone he has all but killed 10 men with his bare hands and his teeth." So shocked was Tarzan by her ingratitude that for a moment he was struck dumb. The police were inclined to be a little skeptical, for they had had other dealings with this same lady and her lovely coterie of gentlemen friends. However, they were policemen, not judges, so they decided to place all the inmates of the room under arrest and let another, whose business it was, separate the innocent from the guilty. But they found that it was one thing to tell this well-dressed young man that he was under arrest, but quite another to enforce it. "I am guilty of no offense," he said quietly. "I have but sought to defend myself. I do not know why the woman has told you what she has. She can have no enmity against me, for never until I came to this room in response to her cries for help had I seen her." "Come, come," said one of the officers. "There are judges to listen to all that." And he advanced to lay his hand upon Tarzan's shoulder. An instant later, he lay crumpled in a corner of the room, and then, as his comrades rushed in upon the ape-man, they experienced a taste of what the Apaches had but recently gone through. So quickly and so roughly did he handle them that they had not even an opportunity to draw their revolvers. During the brief fight, Tarzan had noted the open window and, beyond, the stem of a tree or a telegraph pole, he could not tell which. As the last officer went down, one of his fellows succeeded in drawing his revolver and from where he lay on the floor fired at Tarzan. The shot missed, and before the man could fire again, Tarzan had swept the lamp from the mantel and plunged the room into darkness. The next they saw was a lithe form spring to the sill of the open window and leap, panther-like, onto the pole across the walk. When the police gathered themselves together and reached the street, their prisoner was nowhere to be seen. They did not handle the woman and the men who had not escaped any too gently when they took them to the station. They were a very sore and humiliated detail of police. It galled them to think that it would be necessary to report that a single unarmed man had wiped the floor with the whole lot of them, and then escaped them as easily as though they had not existed. The officer who had remained in the street swore that no one had leaped from the window or left the building from the time they entered until they had come out. His comrades thought that he lied, but they could not prove it. When Tarzan found himself clinging to the pole outside the window, he followed his jungle instinct and looked below for enemies before he ventured down. It was well he did, for just beneath stood a policeman. Above, Tarzan saw no one, so he went up instead of down. The top of the pole was opposite the roof of the building, so it was but the work of an instant for the muscles that had for years sent him hurtling through the treetops of his primeval forest to carry him across the little space between the pole and the roof. From one building he went to another, and so on, with much climbing, until at a cross street he discovered another pole, down which he ran to the ground. For a square or two he ran swiftly. Then he turned into a little all-night cafe, and in the lavatory removed the evidences of his over-roof promenade from hands and clothes. When he emerged a few moments later, it was to saunter slowly on toward his apartments. Not far from them, he came to a well-lighted boulevard which it was necessary to cross. As he stood directly beneath a brilliant arc light, waiting for a limousine that was approaching to pass him, he heard his name called in a sweet feminine voice. Looking up, he met the smiling eyes of Olga de Coude as she leaned forward upon the back seat of the machine. He bowed very low in response to her friendly greeting. When he straightened up, the machine had borne her away. Rokoff and the Countess de Coude both in the same evening, he soliloquized. Paris is not so large after all. Chapter 4. The Countess explains. Your Paris is more dangerous than my savage jungles, Paul, concluded Tarzan, after narrating his adventures to his friend the morning following his encounter with the Apaches and police in the Rue Maule. Why did they lure me there? Were they hungry? D'Arnaud feigned a horrified shudder, but he laughed at the quaint suggestion. It is difficult to rise above the jungle standards and reason by the light of civilized ways, is it not, my friend? He queried banteringly. Civilized ways, forsooth, scoffed Tarzan. Jungle standards do not countenance wanton atrocities. There we kill for food and for self-preservation, or in the winning of mates and the protection of the young. Always, you see, in accordance with the dictates of some great natural law. But here, far, your civilized man is more brutal than the brutes. He kills wantonly, and worse than that, he utilizes a noble sentiment, the brotherhood of man, as a lure to entice his unwary victim to his doom. It was in answer to an appeal from a fellow being that I hastened to that room where the assassins lay in wait for me. I could not realize for a long time afterward that any woman could sink to such moral depravity as that one must have to call a would-be rescuer to death. But it must have been so. The sight of Rokoff there and the woman's later repudiation of me to the police make it impossible to place any other construction upon her acts. Rokoff must have known that I frequently passed through the Rue Maule. He lay in wait for me, his entire scheme worked out to the last detail, even to the woman's story, in case a hitch should occur in the program, such as really did happen. It is all perfectly plain to me. Well, said D'Arnaud, among other things, it has taught you what I have been unable to impress upon you, that the Rue Maule is a good place to avoid after dark. On the contrary, replied Tarzan with a smile, it has convinced me that it is the one worthwhile street in all Paris. Never again shall I miss an opportunity to traverse it, for it has given me the first real entertainment I have had since I left Africa. It may give you more than you will relish, even without another visit, said D'Arnaud. You are not through with the police yet, remember. I know the Paris police well enough to assure you that they will not soon forget what you did to them. Sooner or later they will get you, my dear Tarzan, and then they will lock the wild man of the woods up behind iron bars. How will you like that? They will never lock Tarzan of the Apes behind iron bars, replied he grimly. There was something in the man's voice as he said it that caused D'Arnaud to look up sharply at his friend. What he saw in the set jaw and the cold grey eyes made the young Frenchman very apprehensive for this great child, who could recognize no law mightier than his own mighty physical prowess. He saw that something must be done to set Tarzan right with the police before another encounter was possible. You have much to learn, Tarzan, he said gravely. The law of man must be respected, whether you relish it or no. Nothing but trouble can come to you and your friends should you persist in defying the police. I can explain it to them once for you, and that I shall do this very day. But hereafter you must obey the law. If its representatives say, come, you must come. If they say go, you must go. Now we shall go to my great friend in the department and fix up this matter of the Rue Maule. Come." Together they entered the office of the police official a half-hour later. He was very cordial. He remembered Tarzan from the visit the two had made him several months prior in the matter of fingerprints. When D'Arnaud had concluded the narration of the events which had transpired the previous evening, a grim smile was playing about the lips of the policeman. He touched a button near his hand, and as he waited for the clerk to respond to its summons, he searched through the papers on his desk for one which he finally located. "Here, Joubon," he said as the clerk entered, "summon these officers, have them come to me at once." And he handed the man the paper he had sought. Then he turned to Tarzan. "You have committed a very grave offense, monsieur," he said, not unkindly, "and but for the explanation made by our good friend here, I should be inclined to judge you harshly. I am, instead, about to do a rather unheard-of thing. I have summoned the officers whom you maltreated last night. They shall hear Lieutenant D'Arnaud's story, and then I shall leave it to their discretion to say whether you shall be prosecuted or not. You have much to learn about the ways of civilization. Things that seem strange or unnecessary to you, you must learn to accept until you are able to judge the motives behind them. The officers whom you attacked were but doing their duty. They had no discretion in the matter. Every day they risk their lives in the protection of the lives or property of others. They would do the same for you. They are very brave men, and they are deeply mortified that a single unarmed man bested and beat them. Make it easy for them to overlook what you did. Unless I am gravely in error, you are yourself a very brave man, and brave men are proverbially magnanimous." Further conversation was interrupted by the appearance of the four policemen. As their eyes fell on Tarzan, surprise was writ large on each countenance. "My children," said the official, "here is the gentleman whom you met in the Rue Maule last evening. He has come voluntarily to give himself up. I wish you to listen attentively to Lieutenant D'Arnaud, who will tell you a part of the story of Monsieur's life. It may explain his attitude toward you of last night. Proceed, my dear lieutenant." D'Arnaud spoke to the policemen for half an hour. He told them something of Tarzan's wild jungle life. He explained the savage training that had taught him to battle like a wild beast in self-preservation. It became plain to them that the man had been guided by instinct rather than reason in his attack upon them. He had not understood their intentions. To him they had been little different from any of the various forms of life he had been accustomed to in his native jungle, where practically all were his enemies. "Your pride has been wounded," said D'Arnaud in conclusion. "It is the fact that this man overcame you that hurts the most. But you need feel no shame. You would not make apologies for defeat had you been penned in that small room with an African lion, or with the great gorilla of the jungles. And yet you are battling with muscles that have time and time again been pitted, and always victoriously, against these terrors of the Dark Continent. It is no disgrace to fall beneath the superhuman strength of Tarzan of the Apes." And then, as the men stood looking first at Tarzan and then at their superior, the ape-man did the one thing which was needed to erase the last remnant of animosity which they might have felt for him. With outstretched hand he advanced toward them. "I am sorry for the mistake I made," he said simply. "Let us be friends." And that was the end of the whole matter, except that Tarzan became a subject of much conversation in the barracks of the police, and increased the number of his friends by 4 brave men at least. On their return to D'Arnaud's apartments, the lieutenant found a letter awaiting him from an English friend, William Cecil Clayton, Lord Greystoke. The two had maintained a correspondence since the birth of their friendship on that ill-fated expedition in search of Jane Porter after her theft by Turcos, the bull ape. "They are to be married in London in about 2 months," said D'Arnaud, as he completed his perusal of the letter. Tarzan did not need to be told who was meant by they. He made no reply, but he was very quiet and thoughtful during the balance of the day. That evening they attended the opera. Tarzan's mind was still occupied by his gloomy thoughts. He paid little or no attention to what was transpiring upon the stage. Instead, he saw only the lovely vision of a beautiful American girl, and heard naught but a sad, sweet voice acknowledging that his love was returned. And she was to marry another. He shook himself to be rid of his unwelcome thoughts, and at the same instant he felt eyes upon him. With the instinct that was his by virtue of training, he looked up squarely into the eyes that were looking at him, to find that they were shining from the smiling face of Olga, Countess de Coude. As Tarzan returned her bow, he was positive that there was an invitation in her look, almost a plea. The next intermission found him beside her in her box. "I have so much wished to see you," she was saying. "It has troubled me not a little to think that after the service you rendered to both my husband and myself, no adequate explanation was ever made you of what must have seemed ingratitude on our part in not taking the necessary steps to prevent a repetition of the attacks upon us by those two men." "You wrong me," replied Tarzan. "My thoughts of you have been only the most pleasant. You must not feel that any explanation is due me. Have they annoyed you further?" "They never cease," she replied sadly. "I feel that I must tell someone, and I do not know another who so deserves an explanation as you. You must permit me to do so. It may be of service to you, for I know Nikolas Rokoff quite well enough to be positive that you have not seen the last of him. He will find some means to be revenged upon you. What I wish to tell you may be of aid to you in combating any scheme of revenge he may harbor. I cannot tell you here, but tomorrow I shall be at home to Monsieur Tarzan at 5. It will be an eternity until tomorrow at 5, he said, as he bade her good night. From a corner of the theatre, Rokoff and Paulvitch saw Monsieur Tarzan in the box of the Countess de Coude, and both men smiled. At 4:30 the following afternoon, a swarthy, bearded man rang the bell at the servants' entrance of the palace of the Count de Coude. The footman who opened the door raised his eyebrows in recognition as he saw who stood without. A low conversation passed between the two. At first the footman demurred from some proposition that the bearded one made, but an instant later something passed from the hand of the caller to the hand of the servant. Then the latter turned and led the visitor by a roundabout way to a little curtained alcove off the apartment in which the Countess was wont to serve tea of an afternoon. A half-hour later, Tarzan was ushered into the room, and presently his hostess entered, smiling and with outstretched hands. "I am so glad that you came," she said. "Nothing could have prevented," he replied. For a few moments they spoke of the opera, of the topics that were then occupying the attention of Paris, of the pleasure of renewing their brief acquaintance which had had its inception under such odd circumstances, and this brought them to the subject that was uppermost in the minds of both. "You must have wondered," said the Countess finally, "what the object of Rokoff's persecution could be. It is very simple. The Count is entrusted with many of the vital secrets of the Ministry of War. He often has in his possession papers that foreign powers would give a fortune to possess, secrets of state that their agents would commit murder and worse than murder to learn. There is such a matter now in his possession that would make the fame and fortune of any Russian who could divulge it to his government. Rokoff and Paulvitch are Russian spies. They will stop at nothing to procure this information. The affair on the liner, I mean the matter of the card game, was for the purpose of blackmailing the knowledge they seek from my husband. Had he been convicted of cheating at cards, his career would have been blighted. He would have had to leave the War Department. He would have been socially ostracized. They intended to hold this club over him, the price of an avowal on their part that the Count was but the victim of the plot of enemies who wished to besmirch his name was to have been the papers they seek. You thwarted them in this. Then they concocted the scheme whereby my reputation was to be the price instead of the Count's. When Paulvitch entered my cabin, he explained it to me. If I would obtain the information for them, he promised to go no farther. Otherwise, Rokoff, who stood without, was to notify the purser that I was entertaining a man, other than my husband, behind the locked doors of my cabin. He was to tell everyone he met on the boat, and when we landed, he was to have given the whole story to the newspaper men. Was it not too horrible? But I happened to know something of Monsieur Paulvitch that would send him to the gallows in Russia if it were known by the police of St. Petersburg. I dared him to carry out his plan, and then I leaned toward him and whispered a name in his ear. Like that, and she snapped her fingers. He flew at my throat as a madman. He would have killed me had you not interfered." "The brutes," muttered Tarzan. "They are worse than that, my friend," she said. "They are devils. I fear for you because you have gained their hatred. I wish you to be on your guard constantly. Tell me that you will, for my sake, for I should never forgive myself should you suffer through the kindness you did me." "I do not fear them," he replied. "I have survived grimmer enemies than Rokoff and Paulvitch." He saw that she knew nothing of the occurrence in the Rue Maule, nor did he mention it, fearing that it might distress her. "For your own safety," he continued, "why do you not turn the scoundrels over to the authorities? They should make quick work of them." She hesitated for a moment before replying. "There are 2 reasons," she said finally. "One of them it is that keeps the Count from doing that very thing. The other, my real reason for fearing to expose them, I have never told. Only Rokoff and I know it. I wonder," and then she paused, looking intently at him for a long time. "And what do you wonder?" he asked, smiling. "I was wondering why it is that I want to tell you the thing that I have not dared tell even to my husband. I believe that you would understand, and that you could tell me the right course to follow. I believe that you would not judge me too harshly." "I fear that I should prove a very poor judge, madame," Tarzan replied, "for if you had been guilty of murder, I should say that the victim should be grateful to have met so sweet a fate." "Oh dear, no," she expostulated, "it is not so terrible as that. But first let me tell you the reason the Count has for not prosecuting these men. Then, if I can hold my courage, I shall tell you the real reason that I dare not. The first is that Nikolas Rokoff is my brother. We are Russians. Nikolas has been a bad man since I can remember. He was cashiered from the Russian army in which he held a captaincy. There was a scandal for a time, but after a while it was partially forgotten, and my father obtained a position for him in the Secret Service. There have been many terrible crimes laid at Nikolas's door, but he has always managed to escape punishment. Of late he has accomplished it by trumped-up evidence, convicting his victims of treason against the Tsar. And the Russian police, who are always only too ready to fasten guilt of this nature upon any and all, have accepted his version and exonerated him. Have not his attempted crimes against you and your husband forfeited whatever rights the bonds of kinship might have accorded him?" asked Tarzan. "The fact that you are his sister has not deterred him from seeking to besmirch your honor. You owe him no loyalty, madame." "Ah, but there is that other reason. If I owe him no loyalty, though he be my brother, I cannot so easily disavow the fear I hold him in because of a certain episode in my life of which he is cognizant. I might as well tell you all," she resumed after a pause, "for I see that it is in my heart to tell you sooner or later. I was educated in a convent. While there, I met a man whom I supposed to be a gentleman. I knew little or nothing about men, and less about love. I got it into my foolish head that I loved this man, and at his urgent request, I ran away with him. We were to have been married. I was with him just 3 hours, all in the daytime and in public places, railroad stations and upon a train. When we reached our destination, where we were to have been married, 2 officers stepped up to my escort as we descended from the train and placed him under arrest. They took me also, but when I had told my story, they did not detain me, other than to send me back to the convent under the care of a matron. It seemed that the man who had wooed me was no gentleman at all, but a deserter from the army as well as a fugitive from civil justice. He had a police record in nearly every country in Europe. The matter was hushed up by the authorities of the convent. Not even my parents knew of it, but Nikolas met the man afterward and learned the whole story. Now he threatens to tell the Count if I do not do just as he wishes me to." Tarzan laughed. "You are still but a little girl. The story that you have told me cannot reflect in any way upon your reputation, and were you not a little girl at heart, you would know it. Go to your husband tonight and tell him the whole story, just as you have told it to me. Unless I am much mistaken, he will laugh at you for your fears and take immediate steps to put that precious brother of yours in prison where he belongs." "I only wish that I dared," she said, "but I am afraid. I learned early to fear men. First my father, then Nikolas, then the fathers in the convent. Nearly all my friends fear their husbands. Why should I not fear mine?" "It does not seem right that women should fear men," said Tarzan, an expression of puzzlement on his face. "I am better acquainted with the jungle folk, and there it is more often the other way around, except among the black men. and they, to my mind, are in most ways lower in the scale than the beasts. No, I cannot understand why civilized women should fear men, the beings that are created to protect them. I should hate to think that any woman feared me." "I do not think that any woman would fear you, my friend," said Olga de Coude softly. "I have known you but a short while, yet though it may seem foolish to say it, you are the only man I have ever known whom I think that I should never fear. It is strange, too, for you are very strong. I wondered at the ease with which you handled Nikolas and Paulvitch that night in my cabin. It was marvelous." As Tarzan was leaving her a short time later, he wondered a little at the clinging pressure of her hand at parting and the firm insistence with which she exacted a promise from him that he would call again on the morrow. The memory of her half-veiled eyes and perfect lips, as she had stood smiling up into his face as he bade her goodbye, remained with him for the balance of the day. Olga de Coude was a very beautiful woman, and Tarzan of the Apes a very lonely young man, with a heart in him that was in need of the doctoring that only a woman may provide. As the Countess turned back into the room after Tarzan's departure, she found herself face to face with Nikolas Rokoff. "How long have you been here?" she cried, shrinking away from him. "Since before your lover came," he answered, with a nasty leer. "Stop!" she commanded. "How dare you say such a thing to me, your sister?" "Well, my dear Olga, if he is not your lover, accept my apologies, but it is no fault of yours that he is not. Had he 1/10 the knowledge of women that I have, you would be in his arms this minute. He is a stupid fool, Olga. Why, your every word and act was an open invitation to him, and he had not the sense to see it." The woman put her hands to her ears. "I will not listen. You are wicked to say such things as that. No matter what you may threaten me with, you know that I am a good woman. After tonight, you will not dare to annoy me, for I shall tell Raoul all. He will understand. And then, Monsieur Nikolas, beware." "You shall tell him nothing," said Rokoff. "I have this affair now, and with the help of one of your servants, whom I may trust, it will lack nothing in the telling, when the time comes that the details of the sworn evidence shall be poured into your husband's ears. The other affair served its purpose well. We now have something tangible to work on, Olga, a real affair, and you a trusted wife. Shame, Olga," and the brute laughed. So the Countess told her Count nothing, and matters were worse than they had been. From a vague fear, her mind was transferred to a very tangible one. It may be, too, that conscience helped to enlarge it out of all proportion. Chapter 5. The Plot That Failed. For a month, Tarzan was a regular and very welcome devotee at the shrine of the beautiful Countess de Coude. Often he met other members of the select little coterie that dropped in for tea of an afternoon. More often, Olga found devices that would give her an hour of Tarzan alone. For a time she had been frightened by what Nikolas had insinuated. She had not thought of this big young man as anything more than friend, but with the suggestion implanted by the evil words of her brother, she had grown to speculate much upon the strange force which seemed to attract her toward the grey-eyed stranger. She did not wish to love him, nor did she wish his love. She was much younger than her husband, and without having realized it, she had been craving the haven of a friendship with one nearer her own age. 20 is shy in exchanging confidences with 40. Tarzan was but 2 years her senior. He could understand her, she felt. Then he was clean and honorable and chivalrous. She was not afraid of him. That she could trust him, she had felt instinctively from the first. From a distance, Rokoff had watched this growing intimacy with malicious glee. Ever since he had learned that Tarzan knew that he was a Russian spy, there had been added to his hatred for the ape-man a great fear that he would expose him. He was but waiting now until the moment was propitious for a master stroke. He wanted to rid himself forever of Tarzan, and at the same time reap an ample revenge for the humiliations and defeats that he had suffered at his hands. Tarzan was nearer to contentment than he had been since the peace and tranquility of his jungle had been broken in upon by the advent of the marooned porter party. He enjoyed the pleasant social intercourse with Olga's friends, while the friendship which had sprung up between the fair Countess and himself was a source of never-ending delight. It broke in upon and dispersed his gloomy thoughts, and served as a balm to his lacerated heart. Sometimes Darnaud accompanied him on his visits to the de Coude home, for he had long known both Olga and the Count. Occasionally de Coude dropped in, but the multitudinous affairs of his official position and the never-ending demands of politics kept him from home usually until late at night. Rokoff spied upon Tarzan almost constantly, waiting for the time that he should call at the de Coude palace at night, but in this he was doomed to disappointment. On several occasions, Tarzan accompanied the Countess to her home after the opera, but he invariably left her at the entrance, much to the disgust of the lady's devoted brother. Finding that it seemed impossible to trap Tarzan through any voluntary act of his own, Rokoff and Paulvitch put their heads together to hatch a plan that would trap the ape-man in all the circumstantial evidence of a compromising position. For days they watched the papers as well as the movements of de Coude and Tarzan. At length they were rewarded. A morning paper made brief mention of a smoker that was to be given on the following evening by the German minister. De Coude's name was among those of the invited guests. If he attended this, meant that he would be absent from his home until after midnight. On the night of the banquet, Paulvitch waited at the curb before the residence of the German minister, where he could scan the face of each guest that arrived. He had not long to wait before de Coude descended from his car and passed him. That was enough. Paulvitch hastened back to his quarters, where Rokoff awaited him. There they waited until after 11. Then Paulvitch took down the receiver of their telephone. He called a number. "The apartments of Lieutenant Darnaud?" he asked, when he had obtained his connection. "A message for Monsieur Tarzan, if he will be so kind as to step to the telephone." For a minute there was silence. "Monsieur Tarzan?" "Ah, yes, monsieur. This is François, in the service of the Countess de Coude. Possibly monsieur does poor François the honor to recall him. Yes?" "Yes, monsieur. I have a message, an urgent message from the Countess. She asks that you hasten to her at once. She is in trouble, monsieur." "No, monsieur. Poor François does not know. Shall I tell madame that monsieur will be here shortly?" "Thank you, monsieur. The good God will bless you." Paulvitch hung up the receiver and turned to grin at Rokoff. "It will take him 30 minutes to get there. If you reach the German minister's in 15, de Coude should arrive at his home in about 45 minutes. It all depends upon whether the fool will remain 15 minutes after he finds that a trick has been played upon him. But unless I am mistaken, Olga will be loath to let him go in so short a time as that. Here is the note for de Coude. Hasten." Paulvitch lost no time in reaching the German minister's. At the door he handed the note to a footman. "This is for the Count de Coude. It is very urgent. You must see that it is placed in his hands at once," and he dropped a piece of silver into the willing hand of the servant. Then he returned to his quarters. A moment later, de Coude was apologizing to his host as he tore open the envelope. What he read left his face white and his hand trembling. "Monsieur le Comte de Coude, one who wishes to save the honor of your name takes this means to warn you that the sanctity of your home is this minute in jeopardy. A certain man who for months has been a constant visitor there during your absence is now with your wife. If you go at once to your countess's boudoir, you will find them together. A friend." 20 minutes after Paulvitch had called Tarzan, Rokoff obtained a connection with Olga's private line. Her maid answered the telephone, which was in the countess's boudoir. "But Madame has retired," said the maid in answer to Rokoff's request to speak with her. "This is a very urgent message for the countess's ears alone," replied Rokoff. "Tell her that she must arise and slip something about her and come to the telephone. I shall call up again in 5 minutes." Then he hung up his receiver. A moment later Paulvitch entered. "The Count has the message?" asked Rokoff. "He should be on his way to his home by now," replied Paulvitch. "Good. My lady will be sitting in her boudoir, very much in negligee, about now. In a minute the faithful Jacques will escort Monsieur Tarzan into her presence without announcing him. It will take a few minutes for explanations. Olga will look very alluring in the filmy creation that is her nightdress, and the clinging robe which but half conceals the charms that the former does not conceal at all. Olga will be surprised, but not displeased. If there is a drop of red blood in the man, the Count will break in upon a very pretty love scene in about 15 minutes from now. I think we have planned marvelously, my dear Alexis. let us go out and drink to the very good health of Monsieur Tarzan in some of old Plançon's unparalleled absinthe, not forgetting that the Count de Coude is one of the best swordsmen in Paris and by far the best shot in all France. When Tarzan reached Olga's, Jacques was awaiting him at the entrance. "This way, monsieur," he said, and led the way up the broad marble staircase. In another moment he had opened a door, and drawing aside a heavy curtain, obsequiously bowed Tarzan into a dimly lighted apartment. Then Jacques vanished. Across the room from him, Tarzan saw Olga seated before a little desk on which stood her telephone. She was tapping impatiently upon the polished surface of the desk. She had not heard him enter. "Olga," he said, "what is wrong?" She turned toward him with a little cry of alarm. "Jean," she cried, "what are you doing here? Who admitted you? What does it mean?" Tarzan was thunderstruck, but in an instant he realized a part of the truth. "Then you did not send for me, Olga." "Send for you at this time of night? Mon Dieu, Jean, do you think that I am quite mad? François telephoned me to come at once, that you were in trouble and wanted me." "François? Who in the world is François?" "He said that he was in your service. He spoke as though I should recall the fact." "There is no one by that name in my employ. Someone has played a joke upon you, Jean," and Olga laughed. "I fear that it may be a most sinister joke, Olga," he replied. "There is more back of it than humor." "What do you mean? You do not think that—" "Where is the Count?" he interrupted. "At the German ambassador's. This is another move by your estimable brother. Tomorrow the Count will hear of it. He will question the servants. Everything will point to what Rokoff wishes the Count to think." "The scoundrel!" cried Olga. She had arisen and come close to Tarzan, where she stood looking up into his face. She was very frightened. In her eyes was an expression that the hunter sees in those of a poor, terrified doe, puzzled, questioning. She trembled, and to steady herself, raised her hands to his broad shoulders. "What shall we do, Jean?" she whispered. "It is terrible. Tomorrow all Paris will read of it. He will see to that." Her look, her attitude, her words were eloquent of the age-old appeal of defenseless woman to her natural protector, man. Tarzan took one of the warm little hands that lay on his breast in his own strong one. The act was quite involuntary, and almost equally so was the instinct of protection that threw a sheltering arm around the girl's shoulders. The result was electrical. Never before had he been so close to her. In startled guilt, they looked suddenly into each other's eyes, and where Olga de Coude should have been strong, she was weak, for she crept closer into the man's arms and clasped her own about his neck. And Tarzan of the Apes? He took the panting figure into his mighty arms and covered the hot lips with kisses. Raoul de Coude made hurried excuses to his host after he had read the note handed him by the ambassador's butler. Never afterward could he recall the nature of the excuses he made. Everything was quite a blur to him up to the time that he stood on the threshold of his own home. Then he became very cool, moving quietly and with caution. For some inexplicable reason, Jacques had the door open before he was halfway to the steps. It did not strike him at the time as being unusual, though afterward he remarked it. Very softly he tiptoed up the stairs and along the gallery to the door of his wife's boudoir. In his hand was a heavy walking stick. In his heart, murder. Olga was the first to see him. With a horrified shriek, she tore herself from Tarzan's arms, and the ape-man turned just in time to ward with his arm a terrific blow that de Coude had aimed at his head. Once, twice, 3 times the heavy stick fell with lightning rapidity, and each blow aided in the transition of the ape-man back to the primordial. With the low, guttural snarl of the bull ape, he sprang for the Frenchman. The great stick was torn from his grasp and broken in two as though it had been matchwood, to be flung aside as the now infuriated beast charged for his adversary's throat. Olga de Coude stood a horrified spectator of the terrible scene which ensued during the next brief moment. Then she sprang to where Tarzan was murdering her husband, choking the life from him, shaking him as a terrier might shake a rat. Frantically she tore at his great hands. "Mother of God," she cried, "you are killing him, you are killing him! Oh, Jean, you are killing my husband!" Tarzan was deaf with rage. Suddenly, he hurled the body to the floor, and placing his foot upon the upturned breast, raised his head. Then through the palace of the Count de Coude rang the awesome challenge of the bull ape that has made a kill. From cellar to attic, the horrid sound searched out the servants and left them blanched and trembling. The woman in the room sank to her knees beside the body of her husband and prayed. Slowly the red mist faded from before Tarzan's eyes. Things began to take form. He was regaining the perspective of civilized man. His eyes fell upon the figure of the kneeling woman. "Olga," he whispered. She looked up, expecting to see the maniacal light of murder in the eyes above her. Instead, she saw sorrow and contrition. "Oh, Jean," she cried, "see what you have done. He was my husband. I loved him, and you have killed him." Very gently, Tarzan raised the limp form of the Count de Coude and bore it to a couch. Then he put his ear to the man's breast. "Some brandy, Olga," he said. She brought it, and together they forced it between his lips. Presently, a faint gasp came from the white lips. The head turned, and de Coude groaned. "He will not die," said Tarzan. "Thank God." "Why did you do it, Jean?" she asked. "I do not know. He struck me, and I went mad. I have seen the apes of my tribe do the same thing. I have never told you my story, Olga. It would have been better had you known it. This might not have happened. I never saw my father. The only mother I knew was a ferocious she-ape. Until I was 15, I had never seen a human being. I was 20 before I saw a white man. A little more than a year ago, I was a naked beast of prey in an African jungle. Do not judge me too harshly. 2 years is too short a time in which to attempt to work the change in an individual that it has taken countless ages to accomplish in the white race. I do not judge at all, Jean. The fault is mine. You must go now. He must not find you here when he regains consciousness. Goodbye." It was a sorrowful Tarzan who walked with bowed head from the palace of the Count de Coude. Once outside, his thoughts took definite shape, to the end that 20 minutes later he entered a police station not far from the Rue Maule. Here he soon found one of the officers with whom he had had the encounter several weeks previous. The policeman was genuinely glad to see again the man who had so roughly handled him. After a moment of conversation, Tarzan asked if he had ever heard of Nikolas Rokoff or Alexis Paulvitch. "Very often indeed, monsieur. Each has a police record, and while there is nothing charged against them now, we make it a point to know pretty well where they may be found should the occasion demand. It is only the same precaution that we take with every known criminal." "Why does monsieur ask?" "They are known to me," replied Tarzan. "I wish to see Monsieur Rokoff on a little matter of business. If you can direct me to his lodgings, I shall appreciate it." A few minutes later, he bade the policeman adieu, and with a slip of paper in his pocket bearing a certain address in a semi-respectable quarter, he walked briskly toward the nearest taxi stand. Rokoff and Paulvitch had returned to their rooms and were sitting talking over the probable outcome of the evening's events. They had telephoned to the offices of 2 of the morning papers, from which they momentarily expected representatives to hear the first report of the scandal that was to stir social Paris on the morrow. A heavy step sounded on the stairway. "Ah, but these newspaper men are prompt," exclaimed Rokoff, and as a knock fell upon the door of their room, "Enter, monsieur." The smile of welcome froze upon the Russian's face as he looked into the hard grey eyes of his visitor. "Name of a name," he shouted, springing to his feet. "What brings you here?" "Sit down," said Tarzan so low that the men could barely catch the words, but in a tone that brought Rokoff to his chair and kept Paulvitch in his. "You know what has brought me here," he continued in the same low tone. "It should be to kill you, but because you are Olga de Coude's brother, I shall not do that now. I shall give you a chance for your lives. Paulvitch does not count much. He is merely a stupid, foolish little tool, and so I shall not kill him, so long as I permit you to live. Before I leave you 2 alive in this room, you will have done 2 things. The first will be to write a full confession of your connection with tonight's plot, and sign it. The second will be to promise me, upon pain of death, that you will permit no word of this affair to get into the newspapers. If you do not do both, neither of you will be alive when I pass next through that doorway. Do you understand?" And without waiting for a reply, "Make haste. There is ink before you, and paper and a pen." Rokoff assumed a truculent air, attempting by bravado to show how little he feared Tarzan's threats. An instant later, he felt the ape-man's steel fingers at his throat, and Paulvitch, who attempted to dodge them and reach the door, was lifted completely off the floor and hurled senseless into a corner. When Rokoff commenced to blacken about the face, Tarzan released his hold and shoved the fellow back into his chair. After a moment of coughing, Rokoff sat sullenly glaring at the man standing opposite him. Presently Paulvitch came to himself and limped painfully back to his chair at Tarzan's command. "Now write," said the ape-man. "If it is necessary to handle you again, I shall not be so lenient." Rokoff picked up a pen and commenced to write. "See that you omit no detail, and that you mention every name," cautioned Tarzan. Presently there was a knock at the door. "Enter," said Tarzan. A dapper young man came in. "I am from the Matin," he announced. "I understand that Monsieur Rokoff has a story for me." "Then you are mistaken, monsieur," replied Tarzan. "You have no story for publication, have you, my dear Nikolas?" Rokoff looked up from his writing with an ugly scowl upon his face. "No," he growled, "I have no story for publication, now." "Nor ever, my dear Nikolas," and the reporter did not see the nasty light in the ape-man's eye. But Nikolas Rokoff did. "Nor ever," he repeated hastily. "It is too bad that monsieur has been troubled," said Tarzan, turning to the newspaper man. "I bid monsieur good evening," and he bowed the dapper young man out of the room and closed the door in his face. An hour later, Tarzan, with a rather bulky manuscript in his coat pocket, turned at the door leading from Rokoff's room. "Were I you, I should leave France," he said, "for sooner or later I shall find an excuse to kill you that will not in any way compromise your sister." Chapter 6. A Duel. D'Arnaud was asleep when Tarzan entered their apartments after leaving Rokoff's. Tarzan did not disturb him, but the following morning he narrated the happenings of the previous evening, omitting not a single detail. "What a fool I have been," he concluded. "De Coude and his wife were both my friends. How have I returned their friendship? Barely did I escape murdering the Count. I have cast a stigma on the name of a good woman. It is very probable that I have broken up a happy home." "Do you love Olga de Coude?" asked D'Arnaud. "Were I not positive that she does not love me, I could not answer your question, Paul. But without disloyalty to her, I tell you that I do not love her, nor does she love me. For an instant we were the victims of a sudden madness. It was not love. And it would have left us, unharmed, as suddenly as it had come upon us, even though de Coude had not returned. As you know, I have had little experience of women. Olga de Coude is very beautiful. That and the dim light and the seductive surroundings, and the appeal of the defenseless for protection might have been resisted by a more civilized man. But my civilization is not even skin deep. It does not go deeper than my clothes. Paris is no place for me. I will but continue to stumble into more and more serious pitfalls. The man-made restrictions are irksome. I feel always that I am a prisoner. I cannot endure it, my friend, and so I think that I shall go back to my own jungle and lead the life that God intended that I should lead when he put me there." "Do not take it so to heart, Jean," responded D'Arnaud. "You have acquitted yourself much better than most civilized men would have under similar circumstances. As to leaving Paris at this time, I rather think that Raoul de Coude may be expected to have something to say on that subject before long." Nor was D'Arnaud mistaken. A week later, on Monsieur Flaubert was announced about 11 in the morning as D'Arnaud and Tarzan were breakfasting. Monsieur Flaubert was an impressively polite gentleman. With many low bows, he delivered Monsieur le Comte de Coude's challenge to Monsieur Tarzan. Would Monsieur be so very kind as to arrange to have a friend meet Monsieur Flaubert at as early an hour as convenient, that the details might be arranged to the mutual satisfaction of all concerned? Certainly. Monsieur Tarzan would be delighted to place his interests unreservedly in the hands of his friend, Lieutenant D'Arnaud. And so it was arranged that D'Arnaud was to call on Monsieur Flaubert at 2 that afternoon, and the polite Monsieur Flaubert, with many bows, left them. When they were again alone, D'Arnaud looked quizzically at Tarzan. "Well," he said, "now to my sins I must add murder, or else myself be killed, said Tarzan. "I am progressing rapidly in the ways of my civilized brothers." "What weapons shall you select?" asked D'Arnaud. "De Coude is accredited with being a master with the sword and a splendid shot." "I might then choose poisoned arrows at 20 paces, or spears at the same distance," laughed Tarzan. "Make it pistols, Paul." "He will kill you, Jean." "I have no doubt of it," replied Tarzan. "I must die some day." "We had better make it swords," said D'Arnaud. "He will be satisfied with wounding you, and there is less danger of a mortal wound." "Pistols," said Tarzan with finality. D'Arnaud tried to argue him out of it, but without avail, so pistols it was. D'Arnaud returned from his conference with Monsieur Flaubert shortly after 4. "It is all arranged," he said. "Everything is satisfactory. Tomorrow morning at daylight, there is a secluded spot on the road not far from Étampes. For some personal reason, Monsieur Flaubert preferred it. I did not demur." "Good," was Tarzan's only comment. He did not refer to the matter again, even indirectly. That night he wrote several letters before he retired. After sealing and addressing them, he placed them all in an envelope addressed to D'Arnaud. As he undressed, D'Arnaud heard him humming a music hall ditty. The Frenchman swore under his breath. He was very unhappy, for he was positive that when the sun rose the next morning, it would look down upon a dead Tarzan. It grated upon him to see Tarzan so unconcerned. "This is a most uncivilized hour for people to kill each other," remarked the ape-man when he had been routed out of a comfortable bed in the blackness of the early morning hours. He had slept well, and so it seemed that his head scarcely touched the pillow ere his man deferentially aroused him. His remark was addressed to D'Arnaud, who stood fully dressed in the doorway of Tarzan's bedroom. D'Arnaud had scarcely slept at all during the night. He was nervous, and therefore inclined to be irritable. "I presume you slept like a baby all night," he said. Tarzan laughed. "From your tone, Paul, I infer that you rather harbour the fact against me." "I could not help it, really." "No, Jean, it is not that," replied D'Arnaud, himself smiling. "But you take the entire matter with such infernal indifference, it is exasperating. One would think that you were going out to shoot at a target, rather than to face one of the best shots in France." Tarzan shrugged his shoulders. "I am going out to expiate a great wrong, Paul. A very necessary feature of the expiation is the marksmanship of my opponent. Wherefore, then, should I be dissatisfied? Have you not yourself told me that Count de Coude is a splendid marksman?" "You mean that you hope to be killed?" exclaimed D'Arnaud in horror. "I cannot say that I hope to be, but you must admit that there is little reason to believe that I shall not be killed." Had D'Arnaud known the thing that was in the ape-man's mind, that had been in his mind almost from the first intimation that de Coude would call him to account on the field of honor, he would have been even more horrified than he was. In silence, they entered D'Arnaud's great car, and in similar silence, they sped over the dim road that leads to Étampes. Each man was occupied with his own thoughts. D'Arnaud's were very mournful, for he was genuinely fond of Tarzan. The great friendship which had sprung up between these two men whose lives and training had been so widely different had but been strengthened by association, for they were both men to whom the same high ideals of manhood, of personal courage, and of honor appealed with equal force. They could understand one another, and each could be proud of the friendship of the other. Tarzan of the Apes was wrapped in thoughts of the past, pleasant memories of the happier occasions of his lost jungle life. He recalled the countless boyhood hours that he had spent cross-legged upon the table in his dead father's cabin, his little brown body bent over one of the fascinating picture books, from which, unaided, he had gleaned the secret of the printed language long before the sounds of human speech fell upon his ears. A smile of contentment softened his strong face as he thought of that day of days that he had had alone with Jane Porter in the heart of his primeval forest. Presently, his reminiscences were broken in upon by the stopping of the car. They were at their destination. Tarzan's mind returned to the affairs of the moment. He knew that he was about to die, but there was no fear of death in him. To a denizen of the cruel jungle, death is a commonplace. The first law of nature compels them to cling tenaciously to life, to fight for it, but it does not teach them to fear death. D'Arnaud and Tarzan were first upon the field of honor. A moment later, de Coude, Monsieur Flaubert, and the third gentleman arrived. The last was introduced to Darnaud and Tarzan. He was a physician. Darnaud and Monsieur Flaubert spoke together in whispers for a brief time. The Count de Coude and Tarzan stood apart at opposite sides of the field. Presently the second summoned them. Darnaud and Monsieur Flaubert had examined both pistols. The two men who were to face each other a moment later stood silently while Monsieur Flaubert recited the conditions they were to observe. They were to stand back to back. At a signal from Monsieur Flaubert, they were to walk in opposite directions, their pistols hanging by their sides. When each had proceeded 10 paces, Darnaud was to give the final signal. Then they were to turn and fire at will until one fell, or each had expended the 3 shots allowed. While Monsieur Flaubert spoke, Tarzan selected a cigarette from his case and lighted it. De Coude was the personification of coolness. Was he not the best shot in France? Presently, Monsieur Flaubert nodded to Darnaud, and each man placed his principal in position. "Are you quite ready, gentlemen?" asked Monsieur Flaubert. "Quite," replied de Coude. Tarzan nodded. Monsieur Flaubert gave the signal. He and Darnaud stepped back a few paces to be out of the line of fire as the men paced slowly apart. 6, 7, 8. There were tears in Darnaud's eyes. He loved Tarzan very much. 9. Another pace, and the poor lieutenant gave the signal he so hated to give. To him it sounded the doom of his best friend. Quickly de Coude wheeled and fired. Tarzan gave a little start. His pistol still dangled at his side. De Coude hesitated, as though waiting to see his antagonist crumple to the ground. The Frenchman was too experienced a marksman not to know that he had scored a hit. Still Tarzan made no move to raise his pistol. De Coude fired once more, but the attitude of the ape-man, the utter indifference that was so apparent in every line of the nonchalant ease of his giant figure and the even unruffled puffing of his cigarette, had disconcerted the best marksman in France. This time Tarzan did not start, but again de Coude knew that he had hit. Suddenly the explanation leapt to his mind. His antagonist was coolly taking these terrible chances in the hope that he would receive no staggering wound from any of de Coude's 3 shots. Then he would take his own time about shooting de Coude down deliberately, coolly, and in cold blood. A little shiver ran up the Frenchman's spine. It was fiendish, diabolical. What manner of creature was this that could stand complacently with 2 bullets in him, waiting for the third? And so de Coude took careful aim this time, but his nerve was gone and he made a clean miss. Not once had Tarzan raised his pistol hand from where it hung beside his leg. For a moment the two stood looking straight into each other's eyes. On Tarzan's face was a pathetic expression of disappointment. On de Coude's a rapidly growing expression of horror, yes, of terror. He could endure it no longer. "Mother of God, Monsieur, shoot!" he screamed. But Tarzan did not raise his pistol. Instead, he advanced toward de Coude, and when Darnaud and Monsieur Flaubert, misinterpreting his intention, would have rushed between them, he raised his left hand in a sign of remonstrance. "Do not fear," he said to them. "I shall not harm him." It was most unusual, but they halted. Tarzan advanced until he was quite close to de Coude. "There must have been something wrong with Monsieur's pistol," he said. "Or Monsieur is unstrung. Take mine, Monsieur, and try again." And Tarzan offered his pistol, butt foremost, to the astonished de Coude. "Mon Dieu, Monsieur," cried the latter, "are you mad?" "No, my friend," replied the ape-man, "but I deserve to die. It is the only way in which I may atone for the wrong I have done a very good woman. Take my pistol and do as I bid." "It would be murder," replied de Coude. "But what wrong did you do my wife? She swore to me that—" "I do not mean that," said Tarzan quickly. "You saw all the wrong that passed between us, but that was enough to cast a shadow upon her name and to ruin the happiness of a man against whom I had no enmity. The fault was all mine, and so I hope to die for it this morning. I am disappointed that Monsieur is not so wonderful a marksman as I had been led to believe." "You say that the fault was all yours?" asked de Coude eagerly. "All mine, Monsieur. Your wife is a very pure woman. She loves only you. The fault that you saw was all mine. The thing that brought me there was no fault of either the Countess de Coude or myself. Here is a paper which will quite positively demonstrate that." And Tarzan drew from his pocket the statement Rokoff had written and signed. De Coude took it and read. Darnaud and Monsieur Flaubert had drawn near. They were interested spectators of this strange ending of a strange duel. None spoke until De Coude had quite finished. Then he looked up at Tarzan. "You are a very brave and chivalrous gentleman," he said. "I thank God that I did not kill you." De Coude was a Frenchman. Frenchmen are impulsive. He threw his arms about Tarzan and embraced him. Monsieur Flaubert embraced Darnaud. There was no one to embrace the doctor, so possibly it was pique which prompted him to interfere and demand that he be permitted to dress Tarzan's wounds. "This gentleman was hit once at least," he said. "Possibly thrice." "Twice," said Tarzan. "Once in the left shoulder and again in the left side. Both flesh wounds, I think." But the doctor insisted upon stretching him upon the sward and tinkering with him until the wounds were cleansed and the flow of blood checked. One result of the duel was that they all rode back to Paris together in Darnaud's car, the best of friends. De Coude was so relieved to have had this double assurance of his wife's loyalty that he felt no rancor at all toward Tarzan. It is true that the latter had assumed much more of the fault than was rightly his. But if he lied a little, he may be excused, for he lied in the service of a woman, and he lied like a gentleman. The ape-man was confined to his bed for several days. He felt that it was foolish and unnecessary, but the doctor and Darnaud took the matter so to heart that he gave in to please them, though it made him laugh to think of it. "It is droll," he said to Darnaud, "to lie abed because of a pinprick. Why, when Bolgani, the king gorilla, tore me almost to pieces, while I was still but a little boy, did I have a nice soft bed to lie on? No, only the damp, rotting vegetation of the jungle. Hidden beneath some friendly bush, I lay for days and weeks with only Carla to nurse me. Poor, faithful Carla, who kept the insects from my wounds and warned off the beasts of prey. When I called for water, she brought it to me in her own mouth, the only way she knew to carry it. There was no sterilized gauze, there was no antiseptic bandage, there was nothing that would not have driven our dear doctor mad to have seen. Yet I recovered to lie in bed, because of a tiny scratch that one of the jungle folk would scarce realize unless it were upon the end of his nose. But the time was soon over, and before he realized it, Tarzan found himself abroad again. Several times De Coude had called, and when he found that Tarzan was anxious for employment of some nature, he promised to see what could be done to find a berth for him. It was the first day that Tarzan was permitted to go out that he received a message from De Coude requesting him to call at the Count's office that afternoon. He found De Coude awaiting him with a very pleasant welcome and a sincere congratulation that he was once more upon his feet. Neither had ever mentioned the duel or the cause of it since that morning upon the field of honor. "I think that I have found just the thing for you, Monsieur Tarzan," said the Count. "It is a position of much trust and responsibility, which also requires considerably physical courage and prowess. I cannot imagine a man better fitted than you, my dear Monsieur Tarzan, for this very position. It will necessitate travel, and later it may lead to a very much better post, possibly in the diplomatic service. At first, for a short time only, you will be a special agent in the service of the Ministry of War. Come, I will take you to the gentleman who will be your chief. He can explain the duties better than I, and then you will be in a position to judge if you wish to accept or no." De Coude himself escorted Tarzan to the office of General Rocher, the chief of the bureau to which Tarzan would be attached if he accepted the position. There the Count left him, after a glowing description to the general of the many attributes possessed by the ape-man which should fit him for the work of the service. A half-hour later, Tarzan walked out of the office, the possessor of the first position he had ever held. On the morrow he was to return for further instructions, though General Rocher had made it quite plain that Tarzan might prepare to leave Paris for an almost indefinite period, possibly on the morrow. It was with feelings of the keenest elation that he hastened home to bear the good news to Darnaud. At last he was to be of some value in the world. He was to earn money, and best of all, to travel and see the world. He could scarcely wait to get well inside Darnaud's sitting room before he burst out with the glad tidings. Darnaud was not so pleased. "It seems to delight you to think that you are to leave Paris, and that we shall not see each other for months perhaps. Tarzan, you are a most ungrateful beast." And Darnaud laughed. No, Paul. I am a little child. I have a new toy, and I am tickled to death." And so it came that on the following day, Tarzan left Paris en route for Marseille and Oran.